Welcome to the PDB Situation Report. I'm Mike Baker, your eyes and ears on the world stage. Let's get briefed. We're starting today's show with an important update from eastern Ukraine, where Russia's offensive in Kharkiv seems to be hitting a wall. We'll chat with retired Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer. He'll share his analysis and insight on exactly what's happening on the ground. Later, we'll turn our focus to the Taiwan Strait. You've probably heard of that, where China's aggressive war games are raising serious alarms. We'll be joined by author Dmitri Alperovitch to unpack the implications of these maneuvers and what they could signal for a potential showdown between the U.S. and China. But first, today's Situation Report spotlight. It appears that Vladimir Putin's offensive in northeastern Ukraine has stalled out as U.S. weapons arrive on the front lines and the Russian military reportedly suffers monumental casualties. White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan, he's the Doogie Howser of National Security Advisors, delivered the U.S. assessments in an interview on Sunday, saying the arrival of U.S. weapons approved by the U.S. Congress in April helped Ukrainian forces turn the tide in recent weeks, preventing Russia from advancing further on the northeastern city of Kharkiv. That's according to a report from Voice of America. Appearing on Face the Nation on Sunday, Sullivan said, quote, "Kharkiv is still under threat, but Russians have not been able to make material progress on the ground in recent days in that area." He noted that President Biden's recent approval for Ukraine to use American-made weapons to strike certain targets inside Russia had helped leaders in Kyiv diminish Moscow's ability to sustain their operations. Ukrainian officials confirmed the first official use of these weapons last Tuesday, which they used to destroy Russian missile launchers in the Belgorod region, roughly 20 miles or so into Russian territory. And those systems were being used by the Russians to bombard Kharkiv. Sullivan said, quote, "The Russians really have kind of stalled out up there, and their advance on Kharkiv is all but over." Ukrainian President Zelensky cautiously echoed those sentiments in his evening address on Saturday, where he declared that Russia's offensive in northeastern Ukraine had failed. He stressed, however, that fighting in the region continued and Ukrainian forces were working to contain Russian forces as well as to try and destroy their remaining units. Now, as we've been tracking on the PDB, Russia officially opened up a new front in their war against Ukraine on the 10th of May, when they mounted a cross-border offensive in the northeast region of Ukraine, throwing some 30,000 troops at Ukraine's frontline defenses. The Russian forces managed to penetrate much of Ukraine's border defenses in the region, capturing several border villages and advancing reportedly as far as 6 miles into Ukrainian territory before Ukrainian reinforcements halted their progress. Since then, Ukrainian forces have managed to retake some border villages and parts of the border city of Volchansk, while reportedly decimating Russia's ranks. While verified details are hard to come by, Russia has reportedly been losing troops at a staggering rate, with Zelensky claiming Russia's losses during the offensive are 8 times higher than Ukraine's. 8 times higher than Ukraine's. Ukraine's defense ministry said on June 1st that Russia had lost more than 38,000 troops during the month of May, which, if accurate, would mark the deadliest month for Moscow's military since their invasion in February of 2022. We should stress again that these figures can't be confirmed, and Ukraine has a habit of issuing casualty numbers that are far higher than the estimates of Kyiv's Western allies. The update out of Kharkiv came just days after President Biden met with Zelensky in Paris and apologized to the Ukrainian leader for the months-long delay in American military aid. Biden said the delay had been exploited by Russian forces in northeastern Ukraine, and, of course, he laid the blame squarely on conservative members of Congress, naturally. Now, despite turning the tide in the Northeast, leaders in Kyiv are urging caution. Officials have previously said that Russia's operations may have been designed to test Ukrainian defenses in advance of a larger summer offensive. The Putin regime has also threatened escalation in response to the limited use of Western-made weapons in Russia. Putin suggested last Wednesday that he may begin arming American and European adversaries with Russian military weapons to attack the West, while, of course, also issuing yet another nuclear threat. All right. When we come back, we'll have more on this with my friend and retired Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer. Don't go away, unless of course, you're just off to pour yourself another cup of blackout coffee In which case, well, hurry back. Hey there, Mike Baker here. If you're a listener to the PDB, you know there's a lot going on in the world today, right? Authoritarian regimes on the march, wars overseas, political turmoil across the globe. This is why now more than ever, you should support those on the right side of history. Now, Blackout Coffee is committed to your values, supporting constitutional rights and certainly supporting those on the front lines, the troops, local law enforcement, and really honoring all hardworking Americans. I'm proud to recommend Blackout Coffee. This is a coffee company that is 100% committed to the American traditional values. From sourcing the beans to the roasting process, customer support, and shipping, they've got an incredible work ethic and are dedicated to promoting your principles and accept absolutely no compromise on taste or quality. Check out blackoutcoffee.com/PDB and use coupon code PDB for 20% off your first order. Ditch those other guys. Seriously, ditch them. Blackout Coffee remains true to your values. That's blackoutcoffee.com/PDB and use coupon code PDB for 20% off your first order. As they say, be awake, not woke. Welcome back to the PDB Situation Report. For more on Russia's offensive in Kharkiv, I want to bring in the president of Project Sentinel, retired Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer. And a caveat, he happens to be a very good friend of mine, and he happens to also be a lot smarter than I am. Tony, welcome.
Oh, not true. Thank you, Mike, for saying that. I think you'll get the checks in the mail, just saying. So.
Yeah, you've told me that. I never do see the checks. You always tell me the check's in the mail. I have yet to receive a check.
So thanks for having me. It's great to join you. By the way, we've talked about this before. You and I are both case officers, so it's interesting that I'm a military case officer. And I went through back before when we had separate but equal schools. I was MOTC, the old school. So much of what I've learned over the years is to listen and try to observe. So I think you and I share that skill. It's like we're always skeptical. As skeptics, you want to absorb and assess before you act. So I think that's what we share. So much of what I do I still do that. I'm not an analyst. I always tell people, it's like, I'm not an analyst. I wasn't smart enough to be in the DI. Those guys are all, high degrees and latte drinkers. I'm not, I don't. Anyway, so regarding the issues relating to the Russian offensive, I think there's several things at play right now. One of those things, which I think has delayed their actions a little bit, is the announcement of NATO and the United States of the change of policy that's going to allow U.S. and NATO weapons to be used to hit Russian targets. That is to say, even in Kharkiv, and Joe Biden tried to say, well, targets next to the issue, the areas where the Russians are occupying. That's what he meant to say. He kind of butchered that, said, well, they're kind of just a little bit inside Russia. What he was trying to say is that anywhere the Russians have occupied areas of actual Russia, that is to say, beyond Ukraine into Russia, the weapons can be used. Do I believe for a minute the Ukrainians will be limited to that? No.
But talk to me about that, Tony, because that implies that somebody other than the Ukrainians are signing off on whatever target package they're coming up with. I mean, is the U.S. engaged in that process?
Yes. So according to my sources, there are several federal agencies, three-letter agencies. We probably know who they are. And they've been essentially using all source intelligence, much of which we obtain through satellites, through SIGINT, and they've been able to put together and provide to the Ukrainians what you and I would call over the horizon. It's things that the Ukrainian tactical intelligence cannot see from its perspective, being in Ukraine or on the border between the Kharkiv area and Russia. So you correctly identify the need to have strategic intelligence capabilities to be effective. And yes, we have been providing those. And that's, again, Mike, that's why I think Putin's taking a step back. And a direct response to that is the flotilla now in Cuba. We have several ships current frigates with some of their latest hypersonic missiles and 2 nuclear submarines, which the Russians have said are not equipped with nuclear weapons. Now, I don't know if I believe that or not, but the response
I believe.
to
Hey, you know what? If Putin says something, by God, I believe it. Come on, he seems like a trustworthy character.
I'm ready to invest
I want to back up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to back up, if I could. I want to back up to their initial offensive. Right, it's been about a month since they launched that offensive around in the northeastern area. Before we get talking, because you're absolutely right. Eventually, we want to get to the hey, look, it's the 1960s all over again with the flotilla, in Cuba. But talk to me about that initial offensive. How much of a surprise was it to both Ukraine, us, NATO, et cetera? And how successful were the Russians initially?
Initially, they gained some pretty good ground. I'd have to go back and look at the list of cities, but there's several cities that were in contention for months. And what the Russians did, it was quite brilliant. I mean, the Russians are brutal fighters. You know that, Mike. And what they did is they figured out there was a series of underground sewers, essentially, long pipes. And what they were doing to finally break the siege is actually sent special operations guys through these sewers to get into the rear area, come up and essentially kill the Ukrainians from behind. It was brilliant. I'm not judging. I'm just here to call balls and strikes. I'm just saying, as a military guy, that was pretty darn smart, and that broke the siege. Yeah. So they were able to get past the initial villages, but then they ran into very concerted, very established barriers. So one of the things the Ukrainians had done wisely is they recognized they were probably going to eventually lose this ground. And so they built layers of defense, much like the Russians did last year, Mike. The Russians had layers of defense which prevented the Ukrainian offensive from being successful. So the Ukrainians just, flipped the script and did the same thing. So that's why the Russians now, I think, are facing more concerted, effective, well-organized defense that they're going to have to go through and break down layer by layer. So that's why I think you see right now the delay, plus the rethinking of what does the change of strategy to allow the Ukrainians more freedom to use weapons against the interior of Russia.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look at maps, say you go back to the middle of 2023, and you look at a map of held territory, right, where both forces were, and then you look at a map from the end of May of this year, there hasn't been a lot of change, right? It's almost like World War I, right? Where you just there's no changes in the front lines, despite just the constant back and forth and the cost of this whole thing. So, to what degree, at that point, where we started providing weaponry, and obviously there's a lag time, it's a logistical process, but to what degree has the approval of U.S. weaponry, and as you pointed out at the beginning of this, the willingness of the current administration in the U.S. to say you can strike certain targets, is it fair to say it's turned the tide, or is that a little bit too optimistic?
I think it's too optimistic. I think despite what the Biden administration said, Mike, there was no diminution of things. You point out correctly. I used to work as part of my covers in DOD as logistics, so I did learn kind of how logistics works. Things were in the pipeline all along, and simply because the funding wasn't there didn't mean the Pentagon stopped sending stuff. It was already there. So what you got to always take, besides Putin lying, the White House lies, especially Jake Sullivan. So Jake Sullivan was putting out this, we need the funding for XYZ. No. A lot of the companies who work with DOD, with the defense community, will continue to manufacture things knowing eventually they're going to get paid. And that's what happened here. So the weapons that were actually coming through the pipeline were actually coming through. I'll tell you this, one of the things that did upset the logistics chain was the bridge falling in Baltimore. This is little known, but at least 5 military Sea Lift Command ships, which had Ukrainian gear on them, was stuck in the port of Baltimore during that time. A large percentage, probably about 25 to 30% of U.S. military support for Ukraine, the heavy stuff, is shipped from the port of Baltimore via the U.S. military Sea Lift Command there. So that did have an effect, but that effect had nothing to do with budget.
Okay. Yeah. Well, you could argue. I'm not saying it was, but if it was a planned operation on the part of the FSB, that would be pretty damn clever.
Yeah, it
But
would.
again, not saying it was. I'm
No,
just
no, I
saying
know.
that
Look, I'm
it
skeptical too.
shows
I'm
it
skeptical
shows the
too.
importance. It shows how small the world is. It shows how the supply chain, whether it's for military gear or not, can be impacted by just one event in one part of the globe.
Yep.
With what's happening now, um, I want to go back to the involvement of the U.S. in approving target packages, and then expand that out to talk about training of Ukrainian personnel. There's been a lot of talk about the French in particular, Emmanuel Macron. I don't know. He's been raising his testosterone levels of late, and he's talking about the importance of training Ukrainian personnel in Ukraine. And then, of course,
Right.
that caused some pushback from Putin, who said, well, that would mean they're fair game, from our targeting perspective. How important has been that involvement, right? Not just the logistics, not just the getting of resources to them, but actually working with the troops, the Ukrainian troops.
So one of Macron's instincts are correct, although I think the policy will get French soldiers killed. There have been some French legionnaires there. They have been killed. This has been underreported, but they weren't there under the French flag. So yeah, there were French special operations guys, but they weren't directed to be there. They were there because they wanted to be. Just saying. So this is a change of policy. Mike, one of the things that I've noticed, and I've been around since the 80s, and I remember as a young lieutenant watching us train rebel groups who were going to fight in Latin America at Fort Bragg. I remember going down to Fort Bragg in about 88,
What?
86.
Are you
Yeah,
are you breaking news? We were training rebel groups. I'm shocked, Tony, that you would release that sort of information. But I'm glad you did it on the
I was
situation
there in the
report.
barracks next to me. What do you want me to say? So, anyway, the idea is we did this. We did a similar program of training, as Pete Schoonmaker, General Schoonmaker, used to call it, around the ranch. They used the entire ranch of NATO to kind of allow all these countries to train Ukrainian forces. This is the problem. It wasn't cohesive. It's like, can you imagine the difference in training between Belgium and Greece? I mean, just the difference in culture alone gives you an outcome that's not compatible. So you train, and Mark, by the way, this was done by that brilliant chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Mark Milley. And I used to, and Mark,
Yeah.
Mark is not the smart. I know Mark, and Mark's just not smart. So I'm just saying. But so this whole idea that this is what I call woke goes to war. They sent all these Ukrainians out. They trained them all over Europe, and then they put them back in Ukraine. It's like, hey, go fight. It's like, yeah, no, you need to have unit cohesion and essentially a massing of forces in a way that's coordinated and effective. They didn't do that. They just said, hey, let's train everybody. So that's part of the reason you've seen massive amounts of money spent, but very little accomplished. So that's my point here. And so Macron's instincts are kind of correct. If you actually train the people in Ukraine in their home nation, you build confidence, you have unit cohesion, and you give senior leadership the ability to do exercises to help hone the military operational skills. That's what was lacking before. So again, right instincts,
Yeah.
timing and policy, I don't know.
No, you're right. I mean, you've got to have consistency in protocols and training, right?
Right.
And it's critically important. And so, as you pointed out, look, the military procedures in France compared to Greece or compared to wherever it may be, you're going to end up with units that have a different approach, and it could be something
Right.
as simple as breaching an entrance.
Absolutely.
So
You got it.
that consistency is critically important. Let's shift gears just slightly and talk about funding all of this, right? And at the G7, right, it looks like they've gone forward with this idea that they're not going to dip into the big pot that's marked frozen Russian assets, but they are going to dip into the pot that's marked interest earned on frozen Russian assets, which is, close to $3.5, almost $4 billion annually. And it's very convoluted. But what
It is.
the idea is, anyway, is the U.S. is going to provide a $50 billion loan to Ukraine and then get paid back from these funds, the interest, right? Talk to me about that a little bit, and to what degree is that $50 billion going to make a significant difference in all of this? And then the question that I think a lot of people have, and we're going to get to that, and that'll kind of be how we wrap this up, because it's almost martini time, is
Cigar time.
what does victory? Yeah, what does victory look like from your perspective for Ukraine?
So the ultimate end state, question, a cessation of hostilities is, I think, the best we can hope for at this point. We will not see Crimea retaken. We will not see Kharkiv. We will not see any of these areas, because unless NATO goes in directly, and I've said this from the first month of the war, Mike, unless there's an outside military force of significance, like troops, you will not push back the Russians. The Russians have a 7-1 advantage, and they're not even trying. Now, they're not doing as well as they'd like. This is where the messaging is all off. The Russians are struggling just to get meters of land, and yet somehow, even though they're struggling, you think all of a sudden they're going to turn and invade Poland. That's not going to happen. So I don't believe they can do more, but they do want to keep what they have. So the best I think we can hope for at this point is a partition that would look a lot like North and South Korea in the end. And I think that's where this is all going to go for the end state.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and I don't disagree with you. I don't think there's any way that Putin gives Crimea back, right? I don't see that.
No.
And I don't see Ukraine on its own pushing them out of the existing territory. So, it's unfortunate that you have to say that because of the courage and the resilience of the Ukrainian, people. But the White House, John Kirby's still talking about saying victory is getting them out of every part of Ukraine. I mean, so the White House is still holding that narrative that they're going to have to leave all of Ukraine, and that's what victory is, and that's what we're holding out for. But that's like Netanyahu saying he's going to destroy all of Hamas, right? It's operationally, It's not feasible. So where do you think this goes? How long do you think this runs for? And you're talking essentially about a negotiated settlement that at the end of the day, It sounds like from what you're saying, we all stand there and we look at it and go, okay, after all of this, we're kind of back to where we started before Putin invaded.
So that's the issue. I'm a Reagan guy. We've talked about this a little bit before, Mike. And Reagan, I looked at Reagan's speech on the 40th anniversary of D-Day versus Biden's. And Biden copied a great deal of it, just saying, not that I want to go down that path right now. But Reagan said in the end of his speech, he pointed out that, and he called out the Soviets as the evil empire, but he said, I'm willing to talk to you. I think you want to change, and I want to give you that opportunity. Biden did no such thing. He left no door open. So at this point, I think we're in for continued combat operations. The next wonder weapon, Mike, the F-16s are going to put them in Romania. So that's another potential of the war expanding, putting F-16s bombing Russia in Romania. There's some problems there, but we could probably talk about that another day because that's the consideration on the table right now, because they know the moment they show up in Ukraine, they're going to be bombed. So it's kind of like, you don't want to put F-16s in Ukraine. They're going to be instantly destroyed. But putting them in a third country, Putin will say the same thing about that as he did about the French soldiers. They become combatants the moment they launch operations to attack Russia. So that's the dilemma. The honest answer is, I don't see this ending until November, and only if Trump wins. So.
Okay. Well, but it's an interesting question, and we're going to have to talk about that later because we're basically out of time. So I'm hoping that you will come back. And look, next time when you come back,
absolutely,
don't worry about don't get so dressed up. It's just not necessary. We're very casual here at the Situation Report. Listen. All right. Many thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Tony Shaffer. He's president of Project Sentinel, and I very much appreciate the time. All right. Coming up, we'll examine China's unprecedented military exercises around Taiwan. We're just going from one crisis to another, but that is what we do here at the Situation Report. And their potential implications for regional stability, right? Dmitri Alperovitch, co-founder of CrowdStrike, you may have heard of that company, and author of World on the Brink, joins us to explain why an economic blockade of the island nation might just backfire on Xi Jinping's China. I'll be right back. Hey, Mike Baker here. It's 2024, and, well, you would think that at this point in time, we'd be able to get our hands on anything, really at any time. But that might not be the case when it comes to medical needs, and that's why we all need to be prepared. Let me introduce you to something that can help you be prepared in case the medicines you need are hard to come by. And by the way, we've had record numbers of medication shortages already this year. Introducing the JACE case. JACE, J-A-S-E, the JACE case. It's your personalized emergency medication kit with 5 essential antibiotics addressing common and deadly bacterial infections. Everyone should have life-saving medications on hand before an emergency. That's called being prepared. Getting a JACE case is simple. Look, I've done it, and honestly, it could not be any easier. You just fill out the online form at jace.com. From online evaluation to licensed pharmacy delivery, ongoing consultation and care, JACE handles it all. Visit jace.com and use code MIKE at checkout for an exclusive discount on your order. Again, that's JACE, J-A-S-E.com, and use code MIKE. Don't wait until it's too late. Welcome back to the PDB Situation Report. I want to turn our attention now to the Taiwan Strait, where last month, China launched one of the largest military exercises in recent memory, nearly encircling Taiwan with dozens of warships and fighter jets. This exercise, dubbed Joint Sword 2024A, oh, that's a catchy name, and it kind of implies that there'll be a 2024B, C, D, and, well, you know the rest of the alphabet. Anyway, it was in response to the inauguration of Taiwanese President Lai Ching-te, who Beijing sees as a pro-independence leader challenging its one China policy and threatening regional stability. That's from China's viewpoint. The exercise has led many analysts to suspect that China might go for an economic blockade instead of a full-scale military invasion. But my next guest argues that this approach is unlikely to succeed and would probably lead to war. Joining me now is the co-founder of the cybersecurity firm CrowdStrike and author of the book World on the Brink: How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. I'm very pleased to have Dmitri Alperovitch on the show. Dmitri, thanks so much for joining us here on the Situation Report.
So good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Now, here's the top line question, and you run with it in any direction you want to. Is Xi Jinping's China, are they going to invade in some fashion Taiwan?
Look, I think he wants to. I think he's determined to take Taiwan. Now, he would prefer to do it peacefully. As Clausewitz famously said, every aggressor wants to conquer their neighbors peacefully without opposition. But Xi Jinping also said that if he can't do it peacefully, that he will use force. And they've been preparing the military for 40 plus years to do this operation, which is very, very difficult to pull off. We should not underestimate the level of difficulty here. This would be, if they go for it, probably the most difficult operation ever conducted in military history to take the island of Taiwan. But he wants to do it, and I think he wants to do it in his lifetime and while he's still in power so he can get credit for it. He's very ego-driven, and of course, he's up for re-election in the Chinese Communist Party in 2027, very likely to get another 5-year term. But in 2032, he'll be 79. And in their system, perhaps unlike our system, they don't tend to elect leaders into their 80s. So I'm very worried that that sort of period 28 through 32 is the window for him to potentially launch this invasion.
Okay, well, I mean, for what it's worth, I think you're spot on in terms of this idea that he wants to do it while he's in charge. It's going to be his legacy. And I think, people had talked about when could this happen. And the timeline was always fairly well extended out into the future, but that's been compressed of late, I think. So you argue that, if it's not a military invasion and it's an economic blockade, that the end result could still be the same, a full-out war.
Yeah, I do not believe that Taiwan will surrender to an economic blockade for several reasons. First of all, there's no historical precedent in modern times for cities, much less countries, and Taiwan is a nation of 24 million people surrendering just because their economy is going south. You could look at the siege of Leningrad during World War II by the Nazis. 1.1 million people starved to death. The Soviets did not surrender. More recent times, the siege of Sarajevo in the 1990s, 65,000 casualties, but the city did not surrender. So this idea that the Taiwanese would surrender just because their economy is in trouble, particularly when they know the consequences, right? The Chinese make it very clear what they're going to do to the Taiwanese population once they conquer it. They're talking about re-education camps, and if the Taiwanese have any questions about what that means, all they have to do is look across the strait into what's happening in Xinjiang with the Uyghurs and say, you know what, that doesn't really sound that appealing. And Taiwan, really, as I write in my book, is very self-sufficient. So they have ability to produce a lot of food. Now, it's not Wagyu beef, it's not caviar, it's not going to be a luxurious diet, but they produce a lot of rice. They have a lot of fish in their lakes and rivers. They have a lot of vegetable and pineapple production. So they have enough to sustain themselves, even if it's not going to be the most wonderful diet in the world, but they're going to have enough calories. And it's also tropical climate. So even though they're highly dependent on energy imports, they're also not going to freeze to death, unlike, say, the Ukrainians, whose energy grid is being pummeled by the Russians on a daily basis. And they're not surrendering, of course. So I just don't see any possibility for Taiwan to surrender. And then they have options to go offensively to counter-blockade China, because the top 5 Chinese ports are within striking distance of their missiles. And they can do the same thing to China that China is doing to them.
But, I mean, logistically speaking, from an operational perspective as well, what's your assessment? I mean, if you're saying that Taiwan is doing this on their own, I'm just, as a scenario, I'm not saying that's what would happen. But realistically, for Taiwan to hold out militarily against China, it doesn't seem to be in the cards.
No, I think that if it's an invasion, not just a blockade, but an actual invasion of the island, Taiwan is going to need help. Now, realistically, they shouldn't need it because, as I mentioned, it's an island of 24 million people. It's a very, very difficult place to invade. In fact, last week was the 80th anniversary of D-Day. 160,000 Allied forces crossed the English Channel to land on Normandy, on the beaches of Normandy. At the same time as we were planning that operation and executing it, the Joint Chiefs of Staff in the U.S. military were putting together another amphibious invasion plan, one which never took place, called Operation Causeway, which was a plan to invade Formosa, as Taiwan was called at the time. And that plan called for 300,000 forces, right? 160,000 for Normandy, 300,000 forces for Taiwan. And that was deemed too risky and too dangerous by Roosevelt and Douglas MacArthur and others. So we never went through that. So 80 years ago, 300,000 troops needed to occupy an island that at the time had 6 million people on it and the Japanese occupation. Today, even harder than that. So very, very difficult to pull off. And realistically, if Taiwan had focused on their defenses, particularly over the last 20 years, they could defend themselves, but they haven't. And thus, today, they do require support from us to actually defeat this invasion should it ever come.
Yeah, and that support, what's your assessment? Say that it's a blockade. Let's go with that scenario first. It's an economic blockade of Taiwan. What role does the U.S., what role do the rest of the West, what do they play in this? Or do they just stand by and see what happens?
I don't think so, because we are going to be immediately impacted, and the rest of the world is going to be impacted, because Taiwan, of course, is the world's chips factory, right? So many of the semiconductors, both advanced and foundational, are being produced in Taiwan. They're absolutely a requirement for the world economy. Some of the estimates are that we would lose trillions of dollars in GDP if there's a blockade or invasion of Taiwan. So, and by the way, China would be heavily impacted as well. So the pressure on them from the rest of the world, including the United States, and even domestically, every single day that this blockade goes by is going to be absolutely immense. And one of the things I argue is that Taiwan can do the one thing that China doesn't want it to do, which is declare independence if this blockade is being instituted against them. And one of the things that the United States could do is threaten that we would recognize that independence and forever change the status quo in the Taiwan Strait if China does not relent and does not abolish this blockade. So not only does Taiwan have enough resiliency to withstand a blockade, but it also has a number of offensive options that could make life very, very difficult for China.
Okay, let's imagine a scenario it's a bit of both, right? It's an economic blockade. There's some military action. Of course, the PLA will be involved in the blockade from the outset. So, it will be a hybrid military and economic effort. Do you see the U.S.? I know this is a tough question, right? Because we don't know what's going to happen in November in terms of the election coming up in the U.S. But do you really see any U.S. administration, whether it's the Biden administration, a possible Trump administration, coming to the aid militarily? I don't mean just having provided resources, but coming to the aid militarily, as we are doing in Ukraine, for Taiwan.
Well, Biden has now said on 5 occasions, including most recently last week, that he would send American troops to defend Taiwan. But it's a very tough call. I mean, a war with China would be horrendous in terms of loss of life, in terms of devastation to our naval shipping, aviation, and of course, the risk of a conflict with a nuclear power, right? And the risk that it would escalate to a nuclear level. So this is a tough call. It's a tough call for China as well. But this is what China is going to count on, right? China can take Taiwan, as we said, if the U.S. is not going to support it. But it can't count on that today, which is why they haven't launched it yet. And their goal is to increase as much leverage over us as possible, both in the military domain and the economic sphere, to try to deter us from intervening so that they can do this quickly and without a broader war.
So what should the U.S. be doing at this stage of the game, right? If we want to avoid that type of confrontation, and we also want to ensure that we're not taking a massive hit to the economy here in the U.S., what should a U.S. administration be doing?
So look, we want peace, but as President Reagan had said, you want peace through strength. And the key thing here is not to fight a war with China that no one wants. It will be absolutely devastating, and we could incur casualties on a daily level that exceed even what we saw in World War II. The key thing is to deter this from ever taking place, right? That is the Goldilocks scenario. And for that, we need to, first and foremost, restore the balance of power, military balance of power in the region. Because the reality is we are much, much stronger than China on almost every level, right? If you were to imagine a hypothetical scenario of having to fight China in a land war, let's say in Africa, or sea battle in the Atlantic Ocean, it's not even a question that we would beat them handily. The problem is that in this specific scenario, in their backyard, they've built enough capabilities where it's now a question of could we actually beat them or not. And we need to reverse that and once again introduce enough anti-ship missile capabilities, drones, smart mines into that region to make sure that the Chinese fleet can never come across and carry probably what would be the biggest amphibious invasion in history, carrying 500,000, perhaps even more troops across that Taiwan Strait. We need to credibly threaten the sinking of that fleet. Secondly, on the economic front, we need to increase our leverage over China and decrease their leverage over us. So we need to look at our dependencies on China in things like critical minerals, rare earths, lithium, cobalt, nickel, all these things that they're producing in mass quantities, not because they're mining so much of it, although they're doing some of that, but mostly because they're refining and processing in China. We need to divest of that. We need to invest in friendly production and refining of those minerals. And we increase our leverage over them to prevent them from gaining independence in areas like semiconductor production so that they would keep buying chips from Taiwan, from us, from Korea, Japan, and others. So we need to look at this very systematically across every area. How do we decrease their leverage? How do we increase ours?
Listen, Dmitri Alperovitch, I apologize, author of World on the Brink, How America Can Beat China in the Race for the 21st Century. Thank you very much for joining us. This has been fascinating.
Thanks for having me, Mike.
Sure, of course. See you soon. All right. Now, that was cheery, isn't it? And just going from one global crisis to another. In a moment, we'll explore how Tren de Aragua, a notorious gang from Venezuela, has taken root in American cities, bringing with it a wave of crime and violence. Stay tuned as we dive into the gang's origins and its alarming spread across the U.S. Welcome back. All right, let me see. We've talked about the ongoing war in Eastern Europe. We've talked about a possible world-shaking war between China and the U.S. I know Let's talk about deadly street gangs in the U.S. That should cheer you up. I'm talking about a deadly criminal gang now appearing in major cities and towns across the country. U.S. officials report that Tren de Aragua, a gang originating from Venezuela, is now operating within the United States. To understand the roots of this organization, Tren de Aragua, we need to look back at their origins. The gang was formed inside a Venezuelan prison known as Tocaron, where it used the jail as a base of operations. And when I say they used it as a base of operations, what I mean is they had total control of it. When it was finally recaptured by Venezuelan security personnel, they found that prisoners were able to roam freely inside the penitentiary. Well, that's because they had complete control of it. And the prison had essentially become more of a hotel than a jail facility. The facilities actually included a pool, a nightclub, a baseball field, and even a zoo. Yeah, because that's what you want. You're hankering. When you're in prison, you're hankering for a zoo. From there, the group expanded its criminal activities throughout Venezuela and beyond, leveraging the country's turmoil to grow its power and influence. Today, Tren de Aragua has become a formidable transnational organization, posing a significant threat not only to Venezuela and other South American countries, but now, as it turns out, to communities across the U.S. Currently, the scale of the gang's operations in the U.S. is unclear. However, crimes attributed to its members are on the rise, and elected officials are increasingly concerned about how far their influence stretches. An FBI special agent in El Paso explained to CNN that the gang follows migration routes across South America, setting up criminal operations in the various countries along the way. And then they continue to follow the migration routes north right into the United States. Despite numerous arrests, law enforcement is struggling to understand just how many Tren de Aragua members are already here in the U.S. In Texas alone, law enforcement documents and prosecutors' complaints show that more than 70 cases involve individuals affiliated with the gang, with Customs and Border Patrol identifying at least 58 gang members from the beginning of fiscal year 2023 through May of this year. According to a CNN report, Venezuelan immigrants in Florida and other states are witnessing similar criminal activities to those that they fled from in Venezuela. Oh, that's nice. So they flee Venezuela, hoping to escape the crime and violence, and it just follows them up here to the U.S. And we seem to allow that to happen. The group is also establishing itself further north in the U.S. Back in February, we talked about the rise in crime associated with Venezuelan migrant arrivals in New York City. A significant number of those crimes are believed to be associated with Tren de Aragua. Just last week, an illegal immigrant who shot 2 NYPD officers in the Big Apple was reported to have tattoos linked to the gang. Now, in April, 3 suspects were arrested in Louisiana in connection with a Tren de Aragua sex trafficking operation that spans Texas, Virginia, New Jersey, and Florida. If those allegations prove true, well, it indicates that the gang is now operating trafficking rings in the U.S. similar to their trafficking operations in South America. Amid the uptick in crime, Republican lawmakers, led by Florida Senator Marco Rubio and Representative Ana Maria Salazar, urged President Biden to designate Tren de Aragua as a transnational criminal organization in order to halt its growth. The lawmakers warned, quote, if left unchecked, the gang will unleash an unprecedented reign of terror, mirroring the devastation that it's caused in Colombia, Chile, Ecuador, and Peru, end quote. Look, this isn't rocket science, right? If it was rocket science, I wouldn't be talking about it. The first and most important job of the federal government and state and local government is the safety and security of the citizens. Now, to do that, you need a few things. You need a secure and controlled border so that you know who's entering the country. You need federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies and departments that are well-funded, well-trained, and well-supported by everyone from town and city councils to the White House. And you need a justice system that is serious, fair-minded, and oriented towards prosecuting crime and demonstrating that there are actual consequences for criminal behavior. That's your recipe. Combine those ingredients and you get public security. It's not rocket science. Well, that's all the time we have for the PDB Situation Report. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at pdb@thefirsttv.com. And of course, as you know, to listen to the podcast of this show ad-free, well, become a premium member of the President's Daily Brief by visiting pdbpremium.com. It's really that simple. I'm Mike Baker, and until next time, you know the drill. Stay informed, stay safe, stay cool.